welcome to the sixth program in our series, Reckoning U.S. Presidents and Racial Inequality. I'm Robin von Seldeneck with the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library. This series explores individual presidents' views and their political policies toward minority populations. We believe that these discussions among historians that include questions from the public are opportunities for honest conversation and reflection. We would like to thank the National Endowment for Humanities for funding this series. If you are new to this program, I encourage you to visit presidentsandrace.org to view recordings of our previous sessions. This evening, we will be focusing on Theodore Roosevelt, and I am delighted to be joined by the Theodore Roosevelt Humanities Scholar, Clay Jenkinson, who is with the Theodore Roosevelt Center and Dickinson State University in Dickinson, North Dakota. Clay is an expert in several historic figures in addition to Roosevelt. Many of you may know him from his work on the nationally syndicated public radio program and podcast, The Thomas Jefferson Hour. Clay is the winner of many awards, including the National Humanities Medal, which is the highest honor bestowed by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Clay, it is a pleasure to have you with us this evening. Welcome.
Robin, I'm delighted to be here. I greet you from Bismarck, North Dakota, about 120 miles from the Badlands, where Roosevelt became the Roosevelt of American memory.
Well, speaking of the Roosevelt of American memory, you know, Roosevelt is just one of those presidents who's larger than life. He has this great persona. We think of Teddy and the Rough Riders and out in the Badlands and just taking on, there wasn't anything he wasn't afraid to take on. Do you mind just giving us a little background about who Theodore Roosevelt really was?
Well, he was born in New York. He was a sickly child. He adored and even worshiped his father. He called his father the greatest man he ever knew and the only one that he ever feared. And when Roosevelt was about 12 years old, his father said, "My son, your mind is strong, but your body is weak. You will never achieve your potential if you don't make your body." And Roosevelt apparently looked up and said, "I will, Papa. I will make my body." And my goodness, did he. He committed himself to the strenuous life. He overcame his infirmities. He threw himself into adventure, often recklessly. He sought danger. He wanted to prove something to himself, to his father, to his country. And he went on to become possibly the most strenuous president in American history. And that includes George Washington and a few others, the USS Grant, for example, and Dwight D. Eisenhower. So he had a kind of a patrician's desire to reform the country. He threw himself into that first as a U.S. Civil Service Commissioner and a police commissioner of New York. But then after he became the 26th president of the United States, he moved in a more progressive direction. And by 1912, he was one of the most progressive, even radical major political figures in the country. So we at the Theodore Roosevelt Center at Dickinson State are so happy to have this person as our president. It's not Millard Fillmore, and it's not James Buchanan, it's not Gerald Ford, it's TR. And of all the four figures on Mount Rushmore, TR has the likeness that's about the size of his own sense of himself.
That's exactly right. And I do want to encourage our participants who are listening in this evening, if they have any questions, to feel free to use that question and answer button that you have at the bottom of your screen, because we really do want to hear from you. There are so many questions that we could ask. I know that I struggled in narrowing it down. So this could be a 3-hour session, but we promise.
Well, let's do it. We'll take a break in the middle and go out and kill a yak or something.
Well, I have to tell you, here at the Woodrow Wilson site, one of the things that we often laugh about is how Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt were by no means friends, no means friendly. And they're, when I look at who probably Woodrow Wilson's biggest political foe would be, that would be would be Theodore Roosevelt. And yet, we admire both of them for so many qualities, but then both of them definitely had their blinders on in quite a few areas. And I think our country is kind of struggling with that today. And, one of the things as we are going through this series is looking at our presidents in an objective way, so that we're understanding the time period, understanding the individuals, and really trying to figure out how we learn from these individuals without necessarily having good or bad, either or. Maybe it's both and we've said that a couple of times here. So without any delay, let's get started in talking about Theodore Roosevelt. One of the first questions that I think people have talked about of late is that statue that was removed in 2020 in New York, and the background on that. If you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about that, Clay, that would be wonderful.
I will, but let me just say, first of all, Robin, that if your guy had allowed Roosevelt to go off to France in 1917 when he wanted to, all of this would have been, as Roosevelt put it, water, wind, dust on a windy street. But no, Wilson wouldn't allow Roosevelt to lead one more group of Rough Riders, and that really sealed it for our man Theodore Roosevelt. I'm going to show a couple slides here. You don't see that, do you?
Perfect.
Oh, hang on just a second. I just got to pull this up. I know it's a little cumbersome, but I want to be able to show you where I am. So I'm using this term, the white man's burden, of course, in quotation marks, but Roosevelt really belonged to that sort of Kipling view, and it's perhaps not the greatest quality in Theodore Roosevelt. We always try to remember that he was a man of his times, but he also was, without question, an imperialist. And so the statue group that you're talking about that was at the American Museum of Natural History was done by this man, James Earl Fraser. And Fraser was one of the best sculptors of his time. You see here his bust of Roosevelt. And this is the statue group that has now been removed by consensus decision by the American Museum of Natural History. And the reason that it was removed is that you see Roosevelt on horseback, and beside him on his right is a Native American in headdress, barefoot and walking. And on his left is an African gun bearer from his safari, barefoot and walking. And the message of the statue is unmistakable, that Roosevelt is leading these more primitive people into the state of civilization. And it's being removed for a couple of reasons, Robin. First of all, it doesn't really reflect the theme of the American Museum of Natural History. It's dedicated to the wonders of the natural world. This is one aspect of Roosevelt's life, but he was himself a considerable naturalist. He was a great ornithologist. He had intended to become a professional naturalist until he changed his mind at Harvard. And so this doesn't really depict the role that his father, who was one of the creators of the American Museum of Natural History, played, or Roosevelt's own contributions to natural history. So that's one reason. The other reason, of course, is that it's a little bit cringeworthy, and it was cringeworthy before. I remember going to see it in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s and cringing a little at the sense of cultural hierarchy. And now that we're so much more in tune with these sensitivities and rethinking a lot of our history, it seems to me that this is exactly the right thing to do. And I should commend the American Museum, because before they did this, they had a long exhibit contextualizing this and wrestling with this problem. This isn't some hasty decision that was made after a mob appeared in front of the museum or after they woke up one day and decided that this must go. They did this with great and thoughtful deliberation. And that would be my message to people who are concerned about Lewis and Clark statues, Sacagawea statues, Thomas Jefferson statues, even Robert E. Lee statues, that these things should be done in a very deliberative way, and they should be done with everybody at the table, every interested group at the table, and they should not be done in haste. They should be done with an eye to the possibility that these could be teaching moments. And so let me just say this much more about Fraser. This is his most famous sculpture, The End of the Trail. And he was one of the people who created what we call, and I'm using quotation marks, the myth of the vanishing Indian. He is rightly respected for the greatness of this statue, but it did depict a white person's view that the Indian Wars were over, that Native Americans were disappearing from the scene, that they had been defeated, that their spear was now pointed towards the ground, and they were slumped over in defeat, resignation, and exhaustion. And when he was asked about this, he said he actually imagined this man at the shores of the Pacific Ocean, looking away from North America. So, of course, we now find this in many respects unacceptable, however great a piece of sculpture it is. And so just to keep in mind that these are not at all easy decisions, but I applaud the American Museum's removal of this statue group.
Thank you. I appreciate you having that that photo available and sharing, giving us a little more insight on that. We have already had one question come in, and I don't want to get too far from that, so I'm going to go ahead and ask you now. And that is a question. One of the things that you had mentioned is how by 1912 he was probably one of the most progressive, almost to the point of radical. What was it that made him evolve into a more progressive politician?
There are really two types of president: those who decline in office and those who grow in office. And of course, the president of all who grew most in office was Abraham Lincoln. But Roosevelt did too. And from an early period in his life, he read a book a day. He had nearly photographic memory. He was infinitely curious and always wanted to talk with people about whatever the subject was, whether it was Norse saga or big game hunting in Africa, or books about the Napoleonic Wars. And when he was an assemblyman in New York, he was the youngest assemblyman in New York history at the time. There was a cigar bill that was going to prohibit the manufacture of cigars in private dwellings. And he voted against that bill because he believed in the sanctity of contract, that people should be able to contract their labor any way they wished. Samuel Gompers came to see him and said, "I want you to tour some of these tenements with me." And Roosevelt agreed to do it. And they went through a range of tenements in New York. And Roosevelt saw what the conditions were like, 10 or 15 people living in a single room, 5 or 6 people having to share a bed, the windows sealed, no heat, no running water, disease, children 2 and 3 years old already beginning to roll these cigars, disease rampant. And he realized that there are people, especially recent immigrants, who don't have the wherewithal to make a free contract. They're desperate. And so they will do what it takes to get a tin of food to feed their family. And so this helped his evolution. He believed that there are times when government must step in to make sure there's a level, or at least a leveler playing field, and to protect the most vulnerable of our people from exploitation. And this continued as he moved forward. As president, he was more cautious because, of course, he had to make things get their way through Congress. He ruled by executive order where he could, but there were many things that he simply couldn't accomplish. Then he left office on March 4th, 1909. But by the time he came back from his safari, he had moved into a very strongly progressive period of his life at Osawatomie in Kansas. In 1910, he gave what may be the most radical speech by a major political figure in American history. So I think he grew with his understanding that societies are not inherently fair, and that the richest and most powerful people are not eager to share, and that a corporation the size of U.S. Steel or a mogul of the wealth and power of J.P. Morgan have to be counterbalanced with something. And that's something he believed was going to have to be careful government regulation.
And I think you're mentioning a very valid point of how much our country grew during that time period and the number of immigrants who were coming in. And, years ago, I taught English with high school students. And one of the things we really focused on was the role of the muckrakers. So in Upton Sinclair, for example, and his work on the jungle and how that affected Roosevelt in particular, and getting some of the policies in place. Although I think Sinclair had a different idea of what he wanted to have happen, but still a lot of that came about because Theodore Roosevelt really did take the time to listen and to see how, as Jacob Riis said, how the other half lives.
Well, Roosevelt read the book. He wrote a note to Upton Sinclair saying, I think you're exaggerating, of course. You're sensationalizing, but I'm going to look into this. And if you're right, I'll do something about it. And then he said, and I don't like the socialist tract you placed at the end of the novel, but we'll have that conversation later. He looked into it. Things were worse than Upton Sinclair had described in the jungle. Roosevelt set in motion an inspection of our meat supply. And so he saw a problem and then he sought to solve it. And unlike us, he wasn't afraid of government. Now, before we move on, let me just say your guy Wilson co-opted much of the progressive agenda. Roosevelt had to fight tooth and nail to get what he did through Congress. Along comes Woodrow, and he absorbs and co-opts a lot of the progressive agenda. And this really, the only reason I bring it up, because it drove Roosevelt nuts, that Wilson, whom he didn't much respect, was more successful in many respects at the progressive social agenda than he had been. And so no wonder Roosevelt couldn't stand Wilson.
Wilson kind of finished what Roosevelt started and got a lot of credit for a lot of things. So.
And deserves it too, by the way, but we still have to point this out from time to time.
That's right. And by the way, I should tell people, Clay and I have already had a conversation about how interesting it would be to have our two groups get together and have a real back and forth between these two individuals, and how we study them and talk a little bit more about their personalities, because I think it really is fascinating, to say the least. That's for sure.
They should have been allies, and that for a certain period early on they were. Mm-hmm. But when Wilson said that terrible sentence, there's something about being too proud to fight. Mm-hmm. That was it for Roosevelt. Yeah. For him, this meant that Wilson was insufficiently manly, right, to deserve to be the president of the United States. Mm-hmm. And Roosevelt was so unhappy that he didn't get to be the president during the Great War, and thought that why would we have this peacenik, right, this idealist, this book. He called Wilson a Byzantine logothete, and I don't even know what that means, Robert.
I'll tell you, very interesting. That's for sure. Unfortunately, they did have similar views on African Americans and their role here in the United States. Although I do have to give Teddy a lot more credit, because he did invite Booker T. Washington to actually have dinner in the White House, and really took a beating for that.
I think I have to challenge you just slightly on this. I think that Roosevelt gets mixed reviews on race and race relations, but they're slightly better, I think, than Wilson's. But it's a very tight little race here. But yes, but Roosevelt was somewhat progressive for his time. He liked African Americans as individuals and had friendships in the African American community, and did some important things as a leader to protect and promote African Americans. He didn't like tribes. He didn't like Italian Americans. He didn't like German Americans. He didn't like Norwegian Americans or Irish Americans. And he didn't like the idea of African Americans as a solidarity group. He thought once you get here, no matter if you were brought here on a slave ship or if you immigrated from Norway, you must check your ethnicity at the door and become a 100% American. And so he had somewhat paternalistic views of African Americans, but they weren't openly racist in the way of some of the and most of the people of his time. And he did some rather remarkable things. And this is the main one, perhaps. On October 16th, 1901, just several weeks into his presidency, as you know, he came in through the back door because McKinley was assassinated in Buffalo. And Roosevelt was meeting with Booker T. Washington, who was an old friend of his. and he invited him to supper in the White House. And it gets a little murky at this point because Roosevelt later said he didn't even think about it. He just extended the invitation. We know that's not quite true. And here is Roosevelt with Booker T. Washington at Tuskegee. But this is the image, and I'm sorry, it's a little pixelated, of the famous dinner. Of course, it wasn't just the two of them. Edith was there and others were there. But notice that Abraham Lincoln is over their shoulders. And they had dinner on October 16th, October 16th, 1901. And the next day, Robin, pandemonium erupted across the South and much of the North. And the Richmond paper said, and I won't use their language, so the president dines an N. If the president dines an N, maybe he means that we should be on social equality with them, and maybe he even wants his daughter to be dating one of them. And the Memphis, Tennessee Scimitar newspaper said this was, quote, the most damnable outrage in the history of the Republic. There was much more and viciously racist blowback. Roosevelt, of course, toughed it out, as he always would, and said he would invite anyone he pleased to dine in the White House, but he never did this again. Just one more thing about this. Think of that, Robin, the most damnable outrage in the history of the Republic. Black slaves built the White House. They built Washington, D.C. They had served in many capacities within the White House. They had served meals, they had cooked, they had cleaned, they had made beds, they had cleaned water closets and cleansed chamber pots. They had been involved in the life of the White House from the very beginning and had played an essential role in building it and maintaining it. And now, for the first time in 1901, a president invited an African American, as it were, as an equal, to dine as a guest at the White House. And this was regarded as a damnable outrage. It makes you ashamed of the long, sad, tragic race history of this country. And I congratulate Theodore Roosevelt for doing this, because he paid a price for it. Mm-hmm. He also was outspoken in his criticism of lynching, mm-hmm. and paid a price for that. He appointed African Americans to federal posts in the South and paid a price for that. So he was not without moral courage in this way, but it must be said he was also a politician, and he was careful not to, lose the chance for re-election in 1904.
Mm-hmm. Right. And if you look at, and I wish I had the actual statistics and where with me, but I believe I had read somewhere, let's say 1870, over 130,000 African-American men voted in Mississippi. By 1900, it was less than 1,300 because of the poll tax and the literacy tax and all of those different ways that the former Confederate states were disenfranchising African-American voters during that time period. So, you have to wonder sometimes what are the consequences, just like you said, the political piece. If Theodore Roosevelt is inviting an African-American in, how do these Southern states retaliate? Well, then you have an increase in lynching in men. I think it was like 1,300 were lynched during his presidency in the South and the Midwest. So,
and keep in mind that even as late as 1969, Richard Nixon's Southern strategy,
right,
was to quietly invoke racial hatreds in the South to steal the Republican Party away from its traditional base amongst the Democrats. And when John Kennedy made that extraordinary speech in 1963, really one of his best speeches as a White House television speech about the need for us to rise to the moral standard of civil rights, he fretted before, during, and after that this would cost him election in 1964, and Lyndon Johnson faced the same. So it's not as if this is a problem that existed in Roosevelt's time. As we know from the George Floyd killing and all of its aftermath, it still exists. And now we are seeing attempts in some states to limit access of minorities to the voting booth. This is said openly by political operatives in some states. And so it's not over yet. And I think the great thing about the George Floyd catastrophe if there is a great thing, is that it has forced all of us to think hard about this, to do hard reading, to reflect, and to see in ourselves whatever complicity we have for the unresolved race issues in this country. And I have to say, I put Roosevelt, we'll get to some more negative moments in Roosevelt's career here shortly, but I give him fairly high marks for his moral courage in this way.
Mhm. Well, that's going to lead me into a question that we have from an attendee who said that they had attended the 2019 annual TR Symposium, Dickinson State. Wonderful, entertaining, most informative. But mentions with the question that they had seen a presentation a couple years ago by Lewis Gold, who seemed to indicate that TR and Edith's views really were not that different from Wilson. Do you think that's a fair interpretation? I know you've mentioned that, we brushed on it a little bit, but do you want to elaborate on that a little bit for us?
I would never challenge Lewis Gold. One of the most extraordinary scholars of our time in Roosevelt and Wilson studies. And so, these distinctions may not be that valuable. I think it's fair to say that Roosevelt, by our standards, would be seen as a white supremacist, by which I mean he believed that the Anglo-Saxon people were the acme of human possibility, and that everybody else, including the French and the Slavs and the Italians and so on, were at a lower platform, and this hierarchy worked itself downward. And so although he had friends in the African American community and Native American friends and Italian friends and so on, he did have a race and social hierarchy that he felt very strongly about. And I think Wilson too. And so they both were, let's just put it this way, they both were carrying a software about these things that was born in the Enlightenment and has had a very vicious impact on the history of Western civilization. At the same time, they were both capable of being racists in a more overt way from time to time. And I know about Wilson's problems in this regard. I won't go into those because tonight's subject is TR, but TR definitely believed that African Americans were not yet ready for full equal membership in American life. He assumed they would become so, but these are views that make me stammer as I say them and make us cringe to hear them. And we can be very glad that we have largely overcome those views. Not entirely, I would say, but I think that if you're trying to say who was better and who was worse, I think Roosevelt was a little better on suffrage. I think Roosevelt was a little better on race, but I think that's a marginal distinction. And from the point of view of, say, Skip Gates or, W.E.B. Du Bois, these are distinctions without purpose because these are both essentially white supremacists, although that term is so loaded that one hates to use it.
Right. Agreed. Another question came in that I do want to ask you about before we move on. And that is, did Roosevelt spend any significant amount of time in the American South to see the Southern race relations in action? If so, what were his comments on that? And if he didn't, was that the failure to travel there intentional or just not on the agenda?
No, of course, Roosevelt was bold and never ducked a confrontation in his life. He traveled extensively in the South. Of course, his mother was Southern. His mother was from Georgia. His mother was sort of an unreconstructed Confederate woman. Her brothers had fought in the war. She rooted, at least she favored the Confederacy to a certain degree during the Great Civil War. So he spent time there. He was at Tuskegee. He traveled in the South. Roosevelt was not a person to avoid the harder things in life, and he saw the conditions. And of course, he deplored the black codes and the Jim Crow laws. And so let me first of all just point to this slide. Lynching was a horrible problem well into the middle of the 20th century, and Roosevelt thought hard about it and denounced it, spoke powerfully about it in his denunciations, which was a politically courageous thing to do. And you all know the most famous of all the Roosevelt cartoons by Clifford Merriman This is called Drawing the Line in Mississippi. And Robin, here's what's so interesting about it. So it's about a bear hunt, and Roosevelt wanted to get a bear and he wasn't getting one. So his handler clubbed a bear, an old she bear, and tied it to a tree so that when Roosevelt rode up, he could kill his bear. And famously, Roosevelt said, "I won't kill that bear. Untie that bear. That's not sport." And so this is a true story. So the cartoon shows him indignantly refusing to kill this bear. They made it a teddy bear rather than an old she bear. By the way, the bear actually died of the head wound, but that's another story. So, but it also has two other implications. One is that it was about a border dispute in the South, on the Mississippi border. So drawing the line in Mississippi. But I want to be careful here. But this is also a little bit about lynching. And so the bear is a somewhat race insensitive symbol of African Americans in the South. And Roosevelt is showing his disgust and righteous indignation at this very idea. So it's a pretty loaded cartoon. So the answer to your question is yes, he had lots of time in the South. And I should say this too, and this is about Minnie Cox. This is one of my favorite Roosevelt stories. Minnie Cox was an African-American postmistress at Indianola, Mississippi, and the white racists of Indianola forced her to resign because they refused to accept their mail from a Black woman. She was a federal appointee, so Roosevelt closed the post office. He continued to pay her salary. He closed the post office, and now the people of Indianola had to travel 30 miles to get their mail. And of course, this made them very unhappy with Roosevelt, but it was a really extraordinary and clever thing for Roosevelt to do. And it showed, his steps for racial justice and equality were maybe baby steps, and at times he seems more calculating than maybe we would like. He's certainly no Martin Luther King. He's no LBJ, but he wasn't without moral courage. And when he had the chance to do something that could be meaningful, he did it, and he stuck by it. And so in these instances, I think that he exhibits the kind of strength of character that we want from a great president. But, Jefferson said, we must only attempt no more than the people can bear. And I think that, I guess I'll ask you about Wilson. I think that Roosevelt would have gone farther if he thought he could have. He stopped where he thought he had to stop and still be a viable political figure. Do you feel that's true of Wilson in the same degree, or no?
In a lot of ways, I think for Wilson that a lot of what he did was political. And, he knew he needed those Southern Democrats. And so he played along, and unfortunately, really very poor decisions were made for that political reason.
So I think Roosevelt's impulses were largely right, again, as a paternalist and not as a person who was colorblind by any means, and not a person who was without the same kind of accumulated assumptions and stereotypes and prejudices that people have carried forever in Western civilization. But I think that if he thought he could get away with more by way of racial equality, he would have done it. A good example is 1912, the Bull Moose Party. So bolts away from the Republicans, has its own convention in Chicago. It's a idealistic new party. Women, people who believe in civil service reform, people who are vegetarians. I mean, it was kind of a grab bag of all sorts of reform movements. And the question was, what about the South? Can we gather enough progressive Republicans and independents from the South to make this a viable party if we invite African Americans to our convention? And Roosevelt realized that he could not get those white Southern progressives, if you want to call them that, if he seated African Americans at the convention. And so he then didn't. So that's deplorable from a certain point of view, and yet understandable from another. So I guess here's what I would like to do before we move on, just to go to the beginning here. First of all, this is the TR Center, Robin, at Dickinson State. And I just want to say farewell to my glorious friend and esteemed colleague, Sharon Kilzer. We took this a week ago up on Bullion Butte, the fourth highest point in North Dakota, where Roosevelt spent time. She sends her best, by the way. She's off to do other extraordinary things in her life, but she's been a colossus for the
Yes.
Theodore Roosevelt Center, without which we would not have achieved what we have, and we will miss her sorely. And this is our website. People can go to rooseveltcenter.org. But and we're doing an exhibit, which I invite you all to come to. Our symposium is September 15th through 17th in Dickinson, Western North Dakota. Yes, we do have flight service in North Dakota. And our exhibit is on Roosevelt and Edward S. Curtis, and I'm writing that. But here's what I want to say apropos of this. This was what my mentor, Everett C. Albers of the North Dakota Humanities Council, taught me. Judgment is easy, understanding is hard. That's my motto as we approach these things. I love Roosevelt, and I believe that he was a truly great man and a great president, but not without blemishes and blindnesses and prejudices and weak moments. But our job at the Roosevelt Center is not to judge him or decide how to rank him in some way. Our job is to try to understand him, to elucidate the complexities and the nuances of Roosevelt's character. So that's one thing. The other thing is more evil gets done in the name of righteousness than in any other way. And so we try very, very hard to restrict and restrain our own righteousness about these things, and to give our energies to unearthing the documents, to contextualizing the documents, and then publishing them in a way that allows you, anyone who's watching this tonight, to evaluate these things for yourself. But we don't want to be in the business of scoring judgmental points against historical figures.
Our job is to give you the documents and the materials for you to make that educated decision on your own. I think that's exactly right. So I know you and I had talked, I guess it's probably been a week ago. And one of the things that we talked about was the Brownsville affair. I've had a couple of questions come through on that. And I want you to take a few minutes in case anybody's joining us who do not know the story of that. But also I do want to follow up with one of the questions that we have is TR's reaction to the Brownsville incident. Kind of seems out of character, his rush to judgment. So with that in mind, if you wouldn't mind just sharing a little bit about what happened with those African-American soldiers and how Roosevelt reacted toward that, and why do you think he reacted the way he did so forcefully?
So the Brownsville incident occurred on August 13th and 14th, 1906. So in his second term, he'd been triumphantly reelected in 1904. He's at the height of his powers. He's already on record as denouncing lynching and having invited Booker T. Washington to the White House, and the Minnie Cox affair had occurred. So there was some sort of an incident in Brownsville, which is on the Texas-Mexico border. Fort Brown was there, and there was a group of African-American soldiers who were stationed there. The town was pretty openly racist with respect to these African-American soldiers who were discriminated against and spat upon and treated extremely badly. And on the night of August 13th and 14th, 1906, something happened. There was kind of some sort of a melee, and a white person was injured, another person killed. And to this day, Robin, we don't precisely know what happened. The town and the soldiers were in the state of high tension. That's when things like this can occur. And so there was never a full investigation of it in Roosevelt's time. It was assumed, the white people, of course, said that the African-American soldiers had rioted and done this damage. That's far from clear. But something happened. And Roosevelt wanted the soldiers, the black soldiers, to either confess or to provide illuminating testimony about things. And the soldiers sort of formed a circle and refused to cooperate, except to say that they had not been responsible. And that's what really upset Roosevelt, that there was a kind of a phalanx of uncooperation between the soldiers and the people who were trying to get to the bottom of this. And so he, as I said, he didn't like tribes, whether they were Norwegians or African Americans. He didn't like group solidarity. And so he flew into a kind of righteous rage over this and wound up discharging without honor 167 men. Now, even if there were black men who were partly engaged in that town melee, 167 certainly weren't. And to condemn with this broad brush this whole company without trying to discriminate between active rioters and people who were just asleep in their beds. And so far as we know, they were all or most of them quietly asleep in their beds. And this may have been an incident touched off by the town, by the white people of the town, to frame the black soldiers. We simply still don't know. At any rate, Roosevelt discharged 167 when people, including his vice president, said, look, this isn't right. We need to step back here and have a real investigation, and we cannot rush to judgment in this way. Roosevelt's position only hardened, and he got into a vicious shouting match at a correspondence dinner in Washington, D.C. with an Ohio senator. This brought out the worst in Roosevelt's character, a kind of anger, righteousness, pride, stubbornness, just a belief that if somebody thwarted his direction of how to resolve something like this, that was a violation of some important part of his power or even perhaps his manliness. So this happened. Then in 1972, during the Nixon administration, we realized that this had been a terrible miscarriage of justice, and Congress provided an apology and compensation to the families of the people who had been condemned in this way. But I'll tell you this, that Roosevelt had built up a lot of goodwill in the African-American community all of his life. And he didn't lose it entirely over this, but he lost a lot of ground. And it was tragic because his close friend, Booker T. Washington, didn't know what to think about this man that he heroized, who was capable of this sort of I have to use my words really carefully here, Robin, but it was as if Roosevelt couldn't stand to be challenged by African-American ideas of justice, that he was white, he was the president, he was known to be this man of honor, and how dare these black men presume to challenge his capacity. So there's a white supremacy in this. It's as if, the term I keep not wanting to use it is uppity, but there was this sense that these men were violating the deep secret code of American life, which is you stay in your place. You always stay in your place, which is one reason that he so admired Booker T. Washington, because Washington famously said, pick up your pail where it is. We're going to work to improve the lives of African Americans by accommodating as much of the system as we can and being humble in the face of this and not pushing too hard, too fast. And the big debate in this time was between W.B. Du Bois, whose view was nuts to that. We don't have to cringe in front of any white person ever. Mm-hmm. And Booker T. Washington, whose view was we're going to have to play this very, very carefully if we want to improve the lot of America's African Americans. And Roosevelt liked the Washington approach, which is pretty self-serving if you think about it. And he was a little offended by the more militant approach by people like Du Bois. And this, I think, didn't bother TR much, because when you get into that kind of stubborn fixation, you just harden your principles. I don't think that he lost a lot of sleep over this, but I know that it was tragic for Booker T. Washington and a terrible blow to the African-American community, who had looked upon Roosevelt as maybe the best chance they had amongst the white political community for advancement.
And it makes you wonder, what were the implications of that when 1912 comes around and African Americans are voting for Democrats at that point?
Who does the country belong to? This is the struggle we've had. So the Civil War occurs. Lincoln amazingly says, we can't go on unless we do the right thing with respect to slavery. He said, I don't know what Jefferson meant by all men are created equal, but we can't go on until we do this thing. And then there was this hope in early Reconstruction. But a lot of things happened in the white political community, and the South was really allowed to reassert itself and systematically disenfranchise the African Americans who had seen this moment of hope. And the Black codes and the Jim Crow laws and the lynchings and the beatings and Plessy versus Ferguson and all of that didn't re-enslave the African American community, but it did the closest thing possible without violating 100% the 13th Amendment. And so this is one of the colossal lost opportunities of American life. Now we're in this moment. Are we going to, this is a moment after the George Floyd killing. Will we step up as a people and wrestle this thing to the ground and do the right thing and achieve the dream of American ideals? Or will we duck this yet again in some way because it's coming back? We're not going to stop having this conversation until we finally do it. And I think that the Brownsville incident is a sign of how no matter how enlightened you think you are, Theodore Roosevelt, deep down in there is a person who believes that America belongs essentially to white people.
Well, with that, I want to move forward a little bit here, Clay, and talk about Roosevelt and his relationship with Native Americans. And, one of the things where I think, we applaud and think so highly of Roosevelt for the work that he has, or that he did with starting the national, Wilson is the one who's actually, signing into law the national parks. But, we all
Who's counting? Who's counting, Robin? I mean, come on, he just signed the bill.
But all of us know the hard work Roosevelt put toward that. But that came at a cost, and that came at a cost for homeland of several tribes of Native Americans. And there is that famous quote that's attributed to Roosevelt, and I've got it here. I'll read it. I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indian is the dead Indian, but I believe 9 out of every 10 are, and I shouldn't like to inquire too closely into the case of the 10th.
Right. So you've quoted the worst possible quotation. I've quoted it too from time to time, and I'm always embarrassed for myself when I do.
And that's 1886. So
right. That's my point.
I would like to say there was an evolution of Roosevelt. One would hope.
Absolutely. So this is 1886, the same year as the Haymarket riots in Chicago. And at that point, Roosevelt was a rancher out here in North Dakota. And he said, I just like to bring a couple of my ranch hands with our rifles, and we'll take care of those rioters, those anarchists in Chicago. This was his young, hyper-masculine, too much to prove phase of his life. And he said a lot of dangerous things during this period. And he grew, he evolved. He's better than that. And we shouldn't lock him in to that quotation alone, although it's a terrible and just extremely embarrassing thing for him to have said. This is a photograph of his inauguration, and he invited these Native American leaders, including Geronimo, you see there in the middle, Quanah Parker and others, to his inauguration. And my man, Edward S. Curtis, took this photograph. It's in our exhibit on Roosevelt and Curtis. But here's what's so interesting about it, Robin. It reminds me a little of a Roman triumph, when Caesar or Pompey would come back, and they would then bring these conquered peoples to march in their triumphal parade. It has a little of the feel of that. I don't think that's the only way to see this, but Roosevelt's inauguration was, of course, the most impressive ever, because it's Roosevelt. And there's a little of that sense of the winning of the West in this. He wrote this 4-volume book called The Winning of the West. And I want to go to it if I can get to it here. Yes. Oh, here. So this is a Remington. This was, if you saw Doris Kearns Goodwin's really fine 5-hour docudrama on the History Channel over Memorial Day, I really loved it. Of course, I was thrilled to be in it, along with Stacy Cordery, who's been a huge asset to the Theodore Roosevelt Center. But This is an incident that occurred when he was out in the Badlands. These are Gros Ventre men, they're Hidatsa men, and Roosevelt was out alone, and he saw them, and he was worried that they were going to damage him. They probably weren't, but he got behind his horse and he took out his rifle, and there was a kind of standoff, and he writes about it a little bit self-heroically in his books. But they probably were harmless. They had papers that said they were allowed to be off the reservation, and they really wanted to beg for some sugar or who knows what. But I don't think that they were menacing him. But his mindset was of the frontier, and so he made more of this incident than it deserved. Here's what he said, and I'm going to read this. And sorry, it's a little bit long. I'm going to read it, but this was in The Winning of the West, and it's again cringeworthy. But this is how he felt in the kind of Rudyard Kipling white man's burden paradigm. The most ultimately righteous of all wars is a war with savages, though it is apt to be also the most terrible and inhuman. The rude, fierce settler who drives the savage from the land lays all civilized mankind under a debt to him. American and Indian, Boer and Zulu, Cossack and Tartar, New Zealander and Maori. In each case, the victor, horrible though many of his deeds are, has laid deep the foundations for future greatness of a mighty people. The consequences of struggles for territory between civilized nations seem small by comparison. Looked at from the standpoint of the ages, it is of little moment whether Lorraine is part of Germany or of France, whether the northern Adriatic cities pay homage to the Austrian Kaiser or the Italian king, but it is of incalculable importance that America, Australia, and Siberia should pass out of the hands of their red, black, and yellow Aboriginal owners and become the heritage of the dominant world races. And all you can say to that, Robin, is, oh my, this is not something he rattled off in a speech at the back of a train somewhere or in some bombastic moment. This is a considered, carefully constructed key passage in what he regarded as his magnum opus, The Winning of the West. And you see the point. He believes that it's the burden of the white Anglo-Saxon Northern European peoples to bring the rest of the world's people kicking and screaming, if necessary, into the state of civilization, and that the lands that they occupied in New Zealand or Australia or the American West would have to be cleared of their occupancy. And then just one more, and then I'll come back out if I can make this work. I will only read the first part of this, but this is from Hunting Trips and a Ranchman, one of his trilogy of books he wrote about North Dakota. During the past century, a good deal of sentimental nonsense has been talked about our taking the Indians' land. Now, this is again very early. Now, I do not mean to say for a moment that gross wrong has not been done to the Indians, both by government and individuals. Again and again, the government makes promises impossible to perform and then fails to do even what it might toward their fulfillment, et cetera, et cetera. But he says they didn't really use the land, they only hunted on it and occupied it, and that means that they do not really have title or sovereignty to that land, because that's a concept that you associate with permanent settlement and not nomadism and so on. Well, pretty self-serving definition of sovereignty, of course, but we have to face, I guess I want to just spend a moment on this, Rob. We have to face this. This is part of Theodore Roosevelt. It's also part of the world of Theodore Roosevelt. And as I speak to you, I'm in a home on traditional Mandan land here in North Dakota. The Mandan were displaced and put on a reservation that has been shrunk by executive order and congressional legislation and giant dams without their consultation again and again. So I'm complicit, because I am the beneficiary of the policies that Roosevelt is bold enough to speak so confidently about. We hate to see it in that kind of visceral, in-your-face terms, but he's right that the project of the Europeanization of the Americas is what he has said it was, and that the justification for the conquest of the Americas, and he's only a very, very tiny player in all of that, is exactly what he says, that the white people have presumed all over the world that they can have their way with native peoples, native sovereignty, and native lands and resources. And now, while some justice is being done as the 21st century unfolds, we are very far from facing this in a fully courageous way. And I really applaud Deb Haaland, the new Secretary of the Interior, for convening reconciliation commissions about the boarding schools and so on. This is another conversation that's long overdue. And just give you one example, in North Dakota, Sharon Kilzer and I did a footprint thing about all the different places in North Dakota that Roosevelt did something remarkable in, and one of them was a national park that he created, Sully's Hill National Park, later demoted to a game preserve. But he got that land by simply taking it out of a military reservation that had been there. So this is Dakota land, Sioux, but Dakota land. It had been taken as a military reserve during the Indian Wars. And now when he wanted to create a national park, he simply redefined it as a national park. No consultation with the native peoples, no consideration that this was their sovereign landscape, no idea what was sacred to him and what was not. He just did it. And this happened in Glacier. It happened in the Buffalo Game Preserve in northwestern Montana. It happened all over the country, that our national parks, national forests, national monuments, national game preserves, national wildlife refuges were often enough simply carved out of Native American land, usually without compensation and almost always without really any consultation. And so while we enjoy Glacier, of course, or the Badlands National Park in South Dakota, or Yosemite and Yellowstone, it's important for us to remember that this was done in the name of a very, very great idea. I'm with Ken Burns on that. But there were costs, environmental costs, and principally costs to Native sovereignty.
That's a great point. And I'd like to thank one of the participants who is listening in this evening. Made a very valid point, and that is, and I'll just read this. This is a very important conversation. It would be even stronger with representatives of the community you're discussing, an expanded discussion with experts such as Henry Louis Gates, Philip Deloria, Robert Warrior, et cetera, to provide that expanded understanding of these issues. And that's from a faithful Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listener.
Well, all I can say, Robin, is this is a preliminary conversation to lay the groundwork for much more. The NEH would not have funded you if they didn't expect there to be follow-on in which more and more voices would be at the table. I'm just here to say what little I can to set the table for more discussion.
That's exactly right. And so I ask of all of you who are viewing, whether this is your first session or all of them, to please give us that kind of feedback, because that is exactly the feedback then we can then take to the National Endowment for Humanities, to other grant opportunities, so that we can, to me, this is just the beginning of this conversation, because we can't heal, we can't learn just through 7 simple little sessions on this. This takes a lot of work, and it's expanding and in building. So thank you so much for saying that. And please help us go even farther with this.
However, I want to say that, and of course, I agree with what you just said 100%. And thanks to the people who are sending in their comments. Of course, I'm a white man who's had an enormously privileged life and education. A public humanities scholar. I live off the froth of the immense wealth of our civilization. I've never done a day's honest work in my life, etc. I won't jump on the sword too much here, Robin, but I also think, though, that when we do this, we have to be careful to be nuanced, to be fair, to be balanced, and to contextualize in the fullest possible way, and not simply flagellate ourselves for our sins, which are many. And so I take what's called the whole man theory, that we need to look at individuals for their overall achievement, not forgetting those parts of it that are hard for us to stomach. Although, Robin, I always say, what will they say of us 200 years from now? And I'm not looking forward to that judgment. But here are 3 individuals: Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb; Aung San Suu Kyi, one of my heroes, who's had a real falling away in the world for what has occurred in Myanmar; and then, of course, Thomas Jefferson. And they're all 3 extraordinary benefactors of civilization, and they're all 3 fractured by sin or unresolved prejudices or paradoxes at the heart of their character. A good Christian would say we are all fractured in that way. But even if you take a more secular view, I'm with Hamlet when he says, treat every man according to his deserts, and who shall escape whipping. So I want to make sure that the people who are watching today don't think you and I are just beating up on Theodore Roosevelt. Yes, we're happy to beat up on Wilson, but that's another matter. But we should not, I don't want to just beat up on Theodore Roosevelt. He's a very extraordinary human being in lots of far-reaching and incredible respects. And if he's complex, well, that's why the Theodore Roosevelt Center exists. And we want to get every scrap of Rooseveltiana, every photograph, every piece of film, all of the few audio recordings of Roosevelt, cartoons, newspaper clippings, letters in and letters out, you name it. If it's Rooseveltian, we plan to digitize it, to provide the metadata, and to publish it so that you, the people who are watching us tonight, can make your own evaluations based upon your own selection of the requisite documents. And for the first time in the history of these sorts of projects, Robin, we're democratizing to the point that anyone in a bathrobe 24 hours a day, anywhere on earth, can examine the complete works, all the papers, all the documents related to Roosevelt, and then determine what to select and how to evaluate it. And that, in my opinion, is so much more important than anything I might say about Roosevelt's weaknesses or his greatness. And I don't want to leave the impression with anybody that I'm a net critic of Roosevelt. My role is just to keep trying to figure him out.
Mm-hmm. I think you're exactly right. I mean, as historians, it's our job to be objective. It's hard sometimes because the emotion comes in, because we are dealing with human beings and how other human beings have been treated. But you are exactly right. It is our job to get as much of that information out. And we want people to get this information and make an educated decision based on what's there. And I think that's a very, very important point, Clay. So thank you for that. I did have a question I did want to ask you, and this was sent in to us earlier. Is your organization connected to the new Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library that is being built currently in North Dakota? And if so, how is that happening?
All right, so the great Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library is going to be open, we hope, in 2026 at the time of the 250th birthday of the country. It is a huge project. It's going to be a more than $150 million facility at the heart of the Badlands that Roosevelt loved so much. We wish it so well. We are cousins of them. We started earlier by digitizing Roosevelt's papers, and we have our annual symposium to which I invite people to come. They can go to our site, rooseveltcenter.org, and find theodorerooseveltcenter.org and find out all about that. And we do want people to come out and see our exhibit. We are doing the very basic thing, Robin, of digitizing his papers. And so what that means is, if I just take this sheet from a talk I gave in Philadelphia the other day, this is a document. You scan it. Once you've scanned it, it means nothing until you add metadata and say speech given in such and such a place on such and such an occasion. It's typescript. There's a coffee stain here. It's 14 pages long, etc. You have to add all those descriptors before it's usable. And so we've now processed fully 70,000 Roosevelt documents, ranging from a half sheet of paper to 200 pages. We're on our way to quadruple or quintuple that. It's going to be the first comprehensive presidential digital library. We're enormously proud of that, but it's not glamorous, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
It's not shooting fireworks off of mountaintops or killing yaks or elephants in Africa. This is digitizing and processing, and we have a beautiful staff that does this work. We operate on very slender funds, and we are so proud of it. And we are then supplying this to the TR Presidential Library and to you, and we hope to do joint programming with you and so on. We're doing it without any proprietary interest. We just want to be allowed to finish the job, but this then belongs to the world. We've had the cooperation of Harvard, of the Library of Congress, of the Huntington Library, Denver Public Library, and many other institutions. And our goal is never to stop until it's all there, so that someone, for example, who wants to know about the teddy bear can go to our website and they know that they have seen everything that relates to the teddy bear and there are no omissions. And if they want to know what color Alice Blue was that his daughter Alice wore in the White House, they can go to our site and they'll see every document and photographs and descriptions, so that it's a one-stop shop for all that's Rooseveltian. And then when we're done with this, and of course you're never done because it just keeps creeping up on you. Do you do Alice? Do you do his children? Do you do Elihu Root and Gifford Pinchot? But once we're finished, we will have done it. We'll continue to do programming, but the presidential library will be able to say, go here, look what we've got for you. And we will be proud that we have been able to contribute that basic, unheroic, but extremely important work to Roosevelt lovers everywhere without cost.
Fantastic.
Fantastic.
It's hard work. I'll tell you, we think that we get through with Wilson, and there's a whole treasure trove more that comes. So,
well, you know, each president has more papers. So we went to the Reagan library and said, what's your digitization plan? And they just laughed and said, we have 45 million documents. Where do you want to start?
Right. Well, I want to end. We have one question. I've been saving this question because I think it's a great question to end on. We haven't had any come in a couple of minutes here, but
Okay.
This is a question from our friend Brian saying, "What a great conversation. What do you think were TR's greatest leadership qualities and assets? Which ones were his most challenging to overcome? And I love that you hit on Alice, because he would love to know any little stories on Alice and his relationship with her, quote, an institution in herself."
Well, we should take a short break and I'll do an hour of commentary on Alice. Alice is so great. I mean, here's the thing. I guess here's the most important point, not to get too serious about it, but Alice had her father's intellect, her father's energy, her father's drive, but she was a woman at a time when women had fewer outlets for that kind of massive drive and energy. And as a president's daughter, she couldn't, join the Peace Corps or do things that you might do today. Today, a woman can be a Supreme Court justice, vice president of the United States, soon to be president of the U.S. presidents of colleges and universities, neurosurgeons, you name it. This time, it was like a straitjacket for women's potential. And so she chafed under this, and she knew how to push the buttons on her famous father, and she did it marvelously. So, for example, she smoked, and Roosevelt couldn't stand that. And he said to her once, "No child of mine will smoke in the White House." And so she climbed up on the roof and smoked there. And my favorite story is that when they were at Sagamore Hill during a congressional recess, one of her many, many, many boyfriends drove out in a jalopy, and he was drunk and he crashed into the porch. The Secret Service were kind of freaked out. This was the age of assassinations. And so they went down and they found him. And when they found him slumped over the wheel, passed out, there was a pistol in the car. So now TR has been awakened, and he comes down in his dressing gown and he says, "By Jove, what's going on here?" And the Secret Service man says, "Well, sir, this is what happened." And it goes on. And he's drunk, and he's now passed out, and we found a pistol, but I think it's okay. And then the Secret Service man said to Roosevelt, "May I speak freely, sir?" And Roosevelt said, "Well, of course." And he said, he may be insane. And Roosevelt said, "Well, of course he's insane. He wishes to marry Alice." Alice is great. Stacey Cordery is the world's leading authority on Alice. We've been so lucky to have her in our midst. She's a wonderful asset to all that we do and an advisor to all that we do. Alice eventually got back at her father by saying, of course, as everyone knows, he wanted to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. So they loved each other, but they had a hard time of it. And in her defense, his first wife, Alice, died on Valentine's Day, 1884. Just a young, beautiful woman at the beginning of her life. He never got over that, of course. And he wouldn't talk to his daughter, Alice, about her mother. When she would ask, "Tell me about my mother," he'd say, "Go ask your grandparents. Go ask them." And this was not done to be cruel, but it has a cruel implication for young Alice. And there's just a sense of deficit for her that something was missing and he couldn't supply it because he was so the man of grief. And so they really pushed each other in some beautiful ways. At the wedding, she was married in the White House, of course. Edward S. Curtis was the sole photographer inside. The dress wasn't good enough, the cake wasn't good enough, and the champagne wasn't good enough. And she was just Alice. Bridezilla, I think we would say today. And at the end of it, Edith, her long-suffering stepmother, who had done everything in her power to be good to Alice and to accept Alice, she came up at the end and kissed her on the mouth and said, "We're glad you're going. You've been nothing but trouble." which is fantastic. So yes, that's a really interesting part of his life, but his relations with his other children are equally interesting. And he pushed his sons to be heroes, and they were. One of them wound up getting killed during World War I as a dogfighting aerial pilot. The family dynamics are a little different. The Wilson family dynamics are quite different from the family dynamics of the Roosevelt. The Roosevelt treated the White House as kind of romper room. And there were snakes and there were ponies and there were parrots, and they had a parrot that said, "Hooray for Roosevelt." And Alice would let her garter snake out at, they had a badger named Josiah that he got out in Kansas. And the badger was, badgers are not good pets, and they would be biting the heels of congressmen, and Roosevelt would be just happy with all of this. So the family life really makes it extraordinarily delightful to hone in on TR and his kin. So there was one other little piece to that, and I want to answer it really quickly. What was that, the question?
What were
His
his
strengths.
best leadership strengths, and then what were his largest challenges?
So I'll be really quick with this, Robin. So here's what I love about Roosevelt. He's the writingest president. He's the readingest president, although that could be contested by John Quincy Adams, maybe. If Jimmy Carter lives another 100 years, he'll be the writingest president. He's been really making a run at it. But Roosevelt was a problem solver. So when he inherited the presidency accidentally in September of 1901, he looked around, thought, what are the problems? Well, conservation is one, and what to do with recent immigrants, and the one and the many in terms of economic equality, and our place in the world, and whether do we need an Isthmian canal because we now have the West and the East. So he looked at all these issues, and then he said, all right, I'm going to solve them. And he did it. He did that as much as he could through Congress, and he was a great legislative master. And he did what he couldn't do through Congress by executive action. For example, he sent the entire Great White Fleet around the world without even consulting his cabinet. He created the National Wildlife Refuge System by executive order alone. So he was not afraid of government. He was a Hamiltonian. And he famously said, the Constitution exists for the people and not the other way around. And he believed that America deserved to have a very significant, maybe first place in the world's arena. And in some sense, he carried us kicking and screaming into all of that. So that's the strength. The weak, it's like the I Ching. Our weaknesses are our strengths, and our strengths are our weaknesses. In the hands of somebody else, that level of executive potency and willingness to stretch the Constitution and in some ways simply ignore it, that could be a very, very dangerous thing, I think, as we've seen. And, this was the age of Mussolini. This was the age of Adolf Hitler. We were lucky. We got one of the world's most extraordinary individuals to be our king, our first monarchical president. And on the whole, his outlook and his policies were nation building, nation affirming, and just. Had he been a person of darkness, as he was, say, in Brownsville, that level of executive mastery could have been a menace to this country. And the Constitution was saved, not because he believed in the Constitution particularly much, but because he didn't do anything that really damaged the capacity of the United States to thrive. And so, thank goodness for Roosevelt, but thank goodness he was as deeply educated, and in spite of the massive ego. A visitor to the White House said, you go see Roosevelt and then you go back to your hotel and wring his personality out of your clothes. In spite of the massive ego and the need to dominate, he was deeply humble in certain respects. And so that I find fascinating, that he understood that power is transitory. He called it a kaleidoscopic, that he would have his moment in the sun, that he needed to make the most of it, that he would soon be forgotten. He didn't want a monument. He didn't want a national monument the way Jefferson and Washington and Lincoln got theirs. He said, if you want to see my monument, go visit my national parks.
That's great. Clay, this has been so much fun. I've really enjoyed this evening and chatting with you. And I really look forward to continued conversations. And I think we need to have those happening very
Partnerships. And I'd like to reverse the lens and ask you a few tough ones about your man Woodrow.
Well, invite me on sometime. I'll be happy to do
Oh,
it.
we will, because I'm fascinated by them. And, they are more alike than either one of them wanted to admit.
That's exactly right. So thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us, Clay. We really appreciate that. Thank you for everyone who tuned in this evening. I encourage you all to go to our website, presidentsandrace.org. You'll find excellent in-depth resources on not just Roosevelt, but all of the other presidents that we've covered this far. Next month, we will have our series on President Woodrow Wilson, and the session will feature 4 outstanding scholars on Wilson, Asantewa Bochua, who is with the Smithsonian and is the former curator of the Woodrow Wilson House in Washington, D.C., Dr. John Milton Cooper, who was a Pulitzer Prize finalist for his 2009 biography, Wilson, Dr. Thomas J. Knock, who's the head of the history department at Southern Methodist University and the author of To End All Wars, and historian Patricia O'Toole, who wrote the outstanding 2018 biography, The Moralist, Woodrow Wilson and the World He Made. The program will be held on Thursday, July 14th, 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central. And once again, you would just go to presidentsandrace.org to register for that session. And we look forward to having many of you with us. And do feel free to go back to Presidents and Race, see some of the other sessions that we've already had. Those would include Jackson, Lincoln, Grant, Hayes, Harrison. After we do Wilson, we're gonna talk about someone who doesn't get a lot of attention, and that's Warren Harding. So we look forward to that conversation too. So thank you everyone for tuning in this evening. And Clay, once again, thank you. Look forward to seeing you again sometime very soon.
Thank you, Robin, and Godspeed, Sharon Kilzer.
Yes, thank you, Sharon.